Well, hello and welcome to the Eastern Hemisphere launch of the 2021 report on the global status of carbon capture and storage. My name is Alex Apandis. I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. This is our flagship report that we produce each year to describe how carbon capture and storage is progressing as one of the essential climate mitigation technologies. Please visit the Global CCS Institute website, where the report is available for free download right now. Next slide, please. So to kick off today's agenda, our Chief Executive Officer, Jared Daniels, will make some opening remarks. I will then present the findings of the 2021 status report, and this will be followed by a panel discussion. We're very fortunate to be joined in this panel by Saul Kavanagh from Credit Suisse, Tracy Lothian from ExxonMobil, and Dan Quinn from the Australian Government. Okay, so now let me welcome Jared Daniels, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, to share some observations about the 2021 status report. Over to you, Jared.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Global Status of CCS 2021 report. I am delighted to be with you here today as the new CEO of the Global CCS Institute, an organization that many of you know well. Having worked directly with the Institute for many years as a government official, I am proud to have the opportunity to lead the Institute's talented team as we work to advance CCS deployment globally. When I look over the past 20 years of my career in clean energy and sustainable development, now is truly an exciting time for CCS. The CCS pipeline has been growing consistently since 2017, averaging a 30% growth rate per year. It's now seen as a critical element for meeting the climate challenge, with immense versatility in its applications, both for mitigating emissions and for carbon dioxide removal. We see building momentum in the number of both governments and private company leaders supporting CCS. To me, this feels like we're at the cusp of the next stage for CCS, deployment at scale. Indeed, as you will hear from Alex, there are currently 135 facilities in the CCS pipeline. However, if we are going to meet our climate targets and achieve climate neutrality, we will need to scale global CCS capacity by a factor of 100 by 2050, requiring around $1 trillion US of investment over the next 30 years. The order of magnitude of the challenge is immense, yet it is also achievable, provided that governments, industry, and the finance sector find ways to efficiently and effectively work together. Governments need to establish appropriate policies to support and drive investment. Industry will need to build, own, and operate the CCS facilities, and we already see a willingness from some industry leaders to lean forward. Successful business models that support large capital investments are required. The financial sector has a role to play as well, working together to help share risk and to include CCS in their sustainable development portfolios. What is absolutely crucial is that public and private sectors work hand in hand to put in place appropriate policies that can drive and unlock investments. At the Institute, with our strong and diverse membership, including governments, businesses, and NGOs, and our global convening capability, we stand ready to help facilitate these partnerships. This year, we're releasing our flagship report several weeks ahead of COP26, a critical point in our climate journey. As the conference gets nearer, we expect to see countries commit to net zero targets, and we hope the information included in the status report will strengthen the case for more countries to include CCS in their medium-term plans and long-term strategies. Before handing back to Alex, let me say that I am looking forward to leading the Institute in these exciting and challenging times and engaging with many of you in the weeks, months, and years ahead as we work together to accelerate the deployment of CCS around the globe. Thank you for your attention, and Alex, back over to you.
Well, thanks very much for those comments, Jared. Now, if we could just have the first slide of the presentation. That should be coming any moment now. Next slide, thanks, Ben. Okay, so what is CCS? Well, CCS is a set of technologies that can capture carbon dioxide from almost any large source, including directly from the atmosphere, and permanently and safely store it in the earth. It can help us meet our net zero climate targets whilst also driving the low carbon economy in a number of ways. CCS is extremely versatile, may be applied across emissions intense industries, including the hard to abate sectors such as steel, cement, and chemicals production. CCS enables the production of low carbon hydrogen, which has emerged as an important pathway for emissions reduction across industry and transport. CCS can be retrofitted to existing fossil fuel power plants or incorporated in the design of new plants to provide low carbon dispatchable electricity, which is so important. And CCS can also be combined with bioenergy and waste to energy to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We undoubtedly need a portfolio of climate technologies and solutions. However, it's this versatility of CCS, the fact that it enables both emissions mitigation and removals, that makes it such a unique and important tool in our climate change toolkit. Next slide, please. The CCS has been gathering momentum, as Jared said, over the past 4 years in response to rising climate ambition and rising action. In the first 9 months of 2021, the Institute added 71 new carbon capture and storage facilities to its database of projects, growing the total capacity of CCS project pipeline, including operating facilities, by almost 1/3. Today, our database contains 135 carbon capture and storage facilities across all stages of planning, construction, and operation. Next slide, please. So today there are 27 commercial carbon capture and storage facilities which are operating, 4 are in construction, and 102 facilities are under development. This new growth wave, which started in the year 2017, has replenished the project pipeline and will deliver significant additional carbon dioxide capture and storage capacity in the coming years. This is great news for the CCS industry, good news for the emissions-intense industries looking for carbon management solutions, and even better news for climate action. Next slide, please. So of the 71 new carbon capture and storage facilities that entered the project pipeline this year in 2021, 41 were in North America and 25 were in Europe. These jurisdictions generally have the most progressive investment environments related to CCS, and they remain the leaders in CCS development. 31 of the 41 new facilities in North America are bioethanol plants that will join the proposed Summit network in the USA. This is a great example of multiple relatively small facilities with very low carbon dioxide capture costs, accessing common transport and storage infrastructure to reduce carbon dioxide transport and storage costs. The result is a low-cost CCS network with a total capacity of almost 8 million tonnes per year of carbon dioxide. So whilst the growth in this absolute number of new CCS facilities is impressive, the story behind those numbers is perhaps even more significant, as it demonstrates the expansion of CCS into new markets. So, for example, 2021 witnessed the first commercial CCS facilities to commence development in Belgium, Denmark, Hungary, Indonesia, Italy, Malaysia, and Sweden. We've also seen the first application of CCS to liquefaction of natural gas, the first commercial direct air capture with storage business announced in Europe, and construction commencing on the world's first commercial application of carbon capture and storage to cement production. Next slide, please, Ben. The adoption of more ambitious climate targets and increased action in recent years is the fundamental driver of the growth of carbon capture and storage. Net zero commitments by hundreds of countries, subnational governments, cities, and companies, and the resulting analysis of pathways has reinforced the necessity of CCS. Governments have reacted by strengthening policies to drive private sector investment in CCS. The private sector, seeing a strengthening business case, is responding by advancing new projects and developing new business models to reduce cost and risk. This has given rise to networks as the preferred deployment method and the creation of new strategic business partnerships. There are currently more than 30 CCS networks in development around the world. The role of CCS in supporting the production of low carbon hydrogen and in direct carbon removal from the atmosphere, both of which are essential in a net zero world, is also accelerating investment in CCS. Of the 71 new CCS facilities added in the year 2021, 18 of those are blue hydrogen production facilities. Next slide, please. So this map shows all commercial carbon capture and storage facilities. The red dots are operating or in construction. The dark blue dots are CCS facilities progressing through studies. It's clear that North America and Europe are leaders in CCS development. However, as I'll show later, activity in other regions is also starting to increase. Next slide, please. And this is the CCS project pipeline in tabular form, showing how all 135 facilities are distributed. North America currently hosts 16 of the 27 operating commercial CCS facilities and has 60 across all stages of development. Europe has only 3 operating facilities, but a strong pipeline with 35 in development. Other regions are not yet as advanced. However, we are expecting to see rising numbers over the next couple of years in response to strengthening policy and other business drivers. Next slide, please. So here's a bit more detail. Let's look at the current fleet of CCS facilities that are operating in construction or in advanced development. So this doesn't include early stage studies. This is only the projects that are in front-end engineering and design. The versatility of carbon capture and storage is clearly on display here, with application across multiple industries, including hydrogen and chemicals, fertilizer, iron and steel, cement, bioethanol, waste to energy, direct air capture, and of course in the energy sector, in LNG production and coal and gas-fired electricity generation. So anyone who still claims that CCS is experimental or unproven should just have a look at this chart. The oldest operating CCS facility will turn 50 years old next year. It's also interesting to note that as time passes, CCS is being applied across a much broader range of industries with higher capture costs, such as in electricity generation or even in direct air capture. This is a direct result of the steady reduction in those capture costs over time and the strengthening business case for investment in CCS. Next slide, please. So let's quickly step through some of the highlights of 2021 by region, starting with North America. Possibly the most significant development was the USA rejoining the Paris Agreement and getting behind ambitious science-based climate targets. This sends a very strong signal to the private sector and builds confidence in CCS investments. The USA has also ramped up action, passing the US Energy Act that provides $6 billion of support for CCS out to 2025, and is introducing bills that, if passed, could increase the tax credit for carbon dioxide storage up to $85 per tonne of carbon dioxide. Canada has also proposed a tax credit and regulations that would allow CCS to generate credits under Canada's Clean Fuel Standard, which is similar to California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which of course already recognises carbon capture and storage. Next slide, please. In Europe, Norway confirmed funding support for the flagship CCS network, and construction of the first elements have commenced, including the world's first commercial cement CCS facility. In the EU, the Innovation Fund is expected to be a major source of funding for CCS projects, with several projects having progressed to the final round of the first call. The business case for CCS in Europe is also supported by a strong carbon price and binding net zero target that creates the expectation of even stronger carbon prices in the future. The UK government is advancing its process to support the establishment of 4 CCS networks by the year 2030, with £1 billion of funding available. The announcement on the first 2 clusters is expected imminently, and the Dutch government awarded over €2 billion to capture facilities that form part of the Porthos CCS network. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Asia Pacific region, the Australian government published its low emissions technology statement in late 2020, identifying CCS as a priority technology. It has since announced $300 million in support for CCS commercialisation and CCS networks, and an additional $464 million to support low-emission hydrogen hubs, which includes blue or green hydrogen production. The Australian government has also enabled CCS projects to create carbon credits and to benefit from its emissions reduction fund. China's net zero commitment by 2060, the commencement of China's emissions trading scheme, and the inclusion of CCS in China's 14th five-year plan has incentivized Chinese state-owned enterprises in particular to investigate CCS where it's relevant. And the Japanese government continues to implement a comprehensive RD&D program on CCS and to drive international collaboration. Of particular note is Japan's international collaboration on blue hydrogen. So for example, in late 2020, Japan received the first shipment of blue ammonia from Saudi Arabia. However, the most significant development in the Asia Pacific region in 2021 was the announcement of 3 new CCS projects in Indonesia and Malaysia. These projects, 2 of which are in natural gas processing and 1 in blue ammonia production, are the first commercial CCS projects in developing Asia. Next slide, please. The Gulf Cooperation Council states, or the Middle East, already hold 10% of global CCS installed capacity, with 2 facilities capturing carbon dioxide from natural gas processing and one facility capturing CO2 from a direct reduction iron facility. This region has a large potential for expansion due to its large geological storage resources, oil, gas and petrochemical industry expertise, the recognition by national governments of the role of CCS in emissions mitigation, and the potential for this region to become a leading global supplier of low-carbon hydrogen. Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have all included CCS in their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and their national interests are well served by technologies such as CCS that can reduce emissions from the production and use of fossil fuels. But the Global CCS Institute sees great potential in this region. In fact, we're opening our new office in Abu Dhabi to service Gulf Cooperation Council states. Next slide, please. So the CCS story in 2021 has certainly exceeded our most optimistic expectations. Against the backdrop of an expected global economic downturn precipitated by a global pandemic, action on climate change has actually risen up the priority list, and this has accelerated investments in carbon capture and storage. But the global response to climate change is still grossly inadequate. CCS capacity must increase by more than a factor of 100 by 2050 to meet climate targets. This will require around $1 trillion of capital investment in CCS facilities over the next 30 years. And mobilising that capital in the required timeframe requires stronger policy to incentivise investment. Next slide, please. Ultimately, policy needs to provide investors with confidence that they will receive an appropriate return on their investment over the economic life of the asset. There are many elements to this, but shown here is a high-level summary of actions governments can take to bring private capital to CCS projects. So, for example, governments could define the role of CCS in meeting national emission targets and communicate this to industry and the public. This will build public support and align private sector thinking with net zero targets. Governments could create a bankable value on the storage of carbon dioxide to create a revenue stream for CCS value change. Support exploration and appraisal of geological storage resources. Develop transparent laws to regulate CCS so that compliance risk and liability can be understood and effectively mitigated by project developers. Ensure CCS is not excluded from climate policy support. All options are absolutely necessary. Support the establishment of CCS networks as they offer valuable cost and risk reductions and the opportunity for very large abatement. And finally, where necessary, provide grants or concessional finance to get projects over the line. But to end on a positive note, all of this is already being done to different extents by different governments around the world, and it is starting to deliver results. All we need is more urgency. Next slide, please. So please visit the Global CCS Institute website and download the report. It's available right now, free to all. I'll now hand over to Matt Stain from the Global CCS Institute's advocacy team, who will moderate a panel discussion on CCS and the findings of the CCS of the 2021 Global CCS report. So over to you, Matt.
Well, thanks very much, Alex. It's certainly been a big year for CCS around the world. We've still got time in the clock for 2021. Before we get into the discussion today, I want to play a quick video from Mr. Masayuki Hyodo, who is the CEO of Sumitomo Corporation. Ben, if you could play that video. Thank you.
I am Masayuki Hyodo from Sumitomo Corporation. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak at the Global Status of CCS Report 2021 launch event today. Climate change action, which the members of Global CCS Institute are tackling on a daily basis, is now becoming the most important challenge to achieve global sustainable society. CCS will not only reduce the emissions in the energy sector, but is also well placed to make a significant and necessary contribution to decarbonize other sectors, such as steel, cement, petrochemical, and other industries. It could be said that CCS will play an important role. I believe that the key to achieving carbon neutrality while maintaining the current state of the Earth, where 10 billion people live happily, is to collaborate with all solutions and technologies available to reduce emissions and achieve the goal of net zero. Collaboration is essential.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Hyodo, and to our friends at Sumitomo Corporation. As Alex introduced me, I'm Matt Stain, Senior Advocacy and Communications Advisor at the Global CCS Institute, focusing on the Asia-Pac region. We've got a wonderful panel of speakers this morning, wherever you are in the world. The first speaker up is Saul Kavanagh. Saul is Director of APAC Markets and Head of Integrated Energy Resources and Carbon Research at Credit Suisse. He covers oil, gas, mining, new energy, battery supply chains, and carbon markets. Joining us from Singapore is Tracy Lothian. Tracy is Vice President of Marketing, Finance, and Commercial Development at Exxon Low Carbon Solutions. It's a business launched by Exxon this year to commercialize their low carbon technology portfolio. And last, but certainly never least, is Dan Quinn from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy, and Resources. Dan is General Manager for Resources Strategy. Now, I've got a few questions here. Tracy, I'd like to start with you if possible. One of the big announcements in the CCS space this year was the Houston Ship Channel CCS Innovation Zone, which proposes to bring together multiple stakeholders to capture about 100 million tons of CO2 per annum. Looking at the task ahead for our region when it comes to climate broadly and CCS more specifically, what does that sort of big thinking look like in Asia?
Great, thanks, Matt, and thank you to the Institute. Good to be here. Good to be starting with that big topic of how do we really mobilize the networks that Alex talked about in the introduction. First, I'll just say a few words of introduction about myself and ExxonMobil's Low Carbon Solutions company, which we started in February of this year. So since then, we've been busy putting in place all the experts to really commercialize those technologies. And within Asia Pacific, we now have a team, and I'm pleased to be heading up our finance, marketing, and commercial for Asia Pacific Low Carbon Solutions. I'm in Singapore, and we have a regional team here. And that's really part of what we're trying to do with moving across into Asia, thinking of the networks that really work for CCS in the region. For those that, just to bring up to speed on what we're doing in Houston, as you referenced, Matt, we've really commenced this year on a collaborative effort with a number of important industry players, as well as the government, to really help launch the Houston Hub concept, so the innovation zone, where we're really bringing together the emitters and looking at the opportunity to do large-scale CCS. And I think our confidence in CCS as being a solution to climate change is something that's available today. It's a low-cost way to look at decarbonizing in the hard to decarbonize sectors, particularly looking at heavy industries. And in Houston, the opportunity there is really looking at that industrial hub and the co-location near the reservoirs, which can serve as CO2 sinks in that area. So we're really excited that that collaboration is coming together. We now have 11 partners that we're actively working with there, and of course with the government and the local area. And so it's really that concept that when you look across to Asia, of course there's different challenges across here. I think the concept of the hubs really working collaboratively in those large industrial hubs to understand what does the aggregation look like. And then the challenge here that's different is the sequestration sites aren't necessarily co-located with those emission hubs. And so we're envisaging over here a network where you need to work with the emitters in those hubs, as well as look at a wide range of sequestration options regionally across Asia Pacific. We've done a lot of work throughout the years around the research of that, working across with the Singapore Energy Centre here with various universities to really understand what is that capacity for storage in the region. And we believe there's great potential in that storage, with over 300 million tonnes of capacity, just if you look at the Southeast Asia region alone. So our efforts out here are really focusing on building out that network, because we see that it has huge potential for decarbonisation in the Asia Pacific region.
Great, thanks very much, Tracy. So I'm going to shoot over to you. One of my questions to start off with and start this discussion from a financial perspective is around the drivers of CCS. Now, particularly in Australia, but emerging across the region, there seems to be sort of two factors driving CCS investment. One is investor pressure led by net zero commitments and ESG, and the other is economic prospectivity presented by carbon credits and trading. Can you give us some indication of how investors are approaching that duality now and how they might be moving forward?
Thanks, Matt. I think perhaps a good way to kind of set the context there is 2 years ago, the appetite from the investment community for CCS was pretty much non-existent. But there has been a step change in that perspective since COVID, in particular with the ESG trends we're seeing. I don't know, everyone on this, many people on this call have been working on carbon capture and storage for decades, perhaps up to 3 decades. And frankly, it's been a really hard push, but all of a sudden it feels like CCS's time has come. And what's interesting is it hasn't been coming predominantly from that regulatory standpoint. So when you look at what drivers of CCS are, one is simply the government mandates it, and Gorgon's an example of that. But for the most part, you're then left with, well, if the government's not mandating it, there's either a financial incentive or there's some other kind of driver. And to date, we haven't seen the financial incentive yet. That's important to recognize too. Some parts of the world do have it, but for the most part, we're still seeing any, as Alex pointed out in his presentation, government policy, whether that's direct subsidies, carbon price, or an indirect carbon pricing mechanism. These kind of things can provide that financial incentive, but for most parts of the world, it's still not quite there yet. And frankly, we're looking at financial incentives for these things to maybe wash their face rather than present an attractive opportunity. Now, there's a trend here which could see that become an attractive financial opportunity in the future, but for the time, it's not there. And that then brings you to the last, and what I think is the most important driver, and that is investors are expecting it despite the fact that it might not make any money. And that is about the ESG and decarbonization trend, and that is about investors who are looking across their exposures. Oil and gas is no longer a must-have exposure for a big financial player, a big institutional investor. And I speak to investors every day who are completely torching their oil and gas holdings. So they're just selling out of oil and gas. This has been going on now for about 12 months. And it's not because of the fundamentals. It's not because of the view that there's a structural problem in demand. It's because every month they have to go to their stakeholders, which are often big institutional funds or their direct members, and defend their fossil fuel holding, given the ESG wave and the populist wave against fossil fuels. And a lot of them are completely giving up, right? It's just not worth it. So this is where decarbonisation is really important, and CCS is a crucial part of that. And the investor community, they don't want to see money being lost, but if there's opportunities to do this at a low cost or a nominal cost and reduce that carbon footprint, that can see a company rise to be seen as a leader rather than a laggard on the carbon front. And that can allow some funds to allocate their money still into that fossil fuel space to the industry leaders, but increasingly it's hard to do it to the industry laggards. So I might just leave it there, but I would like to highlight that with increasing carbon policy, whether it's direct government support or the increasing rise of carbon pricing, this can start to become a value accretive opportunity. And Australia is a good example of that, where the recent support we're seeing from a number of Australian government institutions across a few different ranges there, and in particular, the addition of the qualifying for the ACCUs. You're now starting to see some projects which are low on the cost curve actually can make money, right? And what's going to be a step change for CCS is when we can start to see companies articulating CCS as a value accretive item. So it's not just there to tick a box, it's not just there to abate ESG concerns, but actually can get people excited to say, you know what, we'll increase the value of Woodside or Exxon on our models because of a CCS project. We're not there yet, but hopefully the trend is moving in that direction.
Great, thanks very much. Dan, I'd like to bring you into this conversation as well. The Australian federal government recently announced a $250 million fund for CCS hubs, which we first heard about at the federal budget this year. As CCS networks continue to emerge as a trend around the world, what are the opportunities presented to Australia and our regional partners around CCS networks?
Great, thanks very much, Matt, and hello everyone. I guess I'll start off just by, touching on that hubs concept. And so obviously, you know, it's noted in the GCCSI's report that there is an increasing trend towards hubs around the world, and you know, and the logic behind that is fairly sensible, I think, in terms of we see in our existing gas networks the expense of transporting gas over long distances, and you know, when we're trying to bring down the costs of CCS, this is one way that we can do it fairly easily, and it also creates these economies of scale that allow these small producers to come in. So as noted earlier by Alex, you know, we've got the $300 million for the CCUS investments, but we've also got a large amount of money for hydrogen investments, and we've also got a large amount of money for international collaborations on priority low emission technologies that's being led by our former chief scientist, Dr. Finkel. So I think that the opportunities are really to sort of drive down the costs of capture, transport and storage. And some of that is looking at the low-hanging fruit options, like the processes like natural gas processing. We're already involving carbon capture. And some of it, I think, increasingly is looking at the other end as well, in terms of, is there something we can do other than storage to generate economic value out of the CO2? Now, obviously, those are fairly small markets at the moment, but we've seen the global economy shifting rapidly in recent years as we see this sort of energy revolution playing through. So I think that there are big opportunities there. In terms of Australia's opportunities going forward, I mean, we are a very blessed geological nation. We have large geological basins, over 300 of them in the country, and we're only really scratching the surface at the moment in terms of what our storage potential is. So I guess over the next few years, it's really about trying to characterise those remaining basins and really understanding how we link them into these low emission hubs. And as part of that, the Australian government will develop over the next year or so a national CCUS abatement strategy, which will identify priority locations, priority technologies, and the key investments that the Australian government will make to facilitate both CCS but also carbon recycling. I think potentially there are opportunities for Australia to act as a bit of a regional centre for CCS, and we are in conversations with several countries around that. Having said that, there are several hurdles that need to be overcome that are reasonably significant before we get to that point. And I guess one of those key ones will be the establishment of an international trading system for carbon credits. So I might leave it there, Matt.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks very much, Dan. I'd like to open up to more of a round table at this point and bring Alex back in as well. At an event earlier this week, Chris Ashton of Worley said that if we keep developing infrastructure for the energy transition in the same way that we always have, we may not even get halfway to net zero by 2050 because of the time that it takes to get the infrastructure projects up and operating. And a key part of CCS, as we know, is the required infrastructure. Saul, I might kick over to you first and we can sort of bounce this question around. But in your mind, what's key to developing infrastructure at pace over the next 30 years?
Well, as Jerry Maguire said, it showed me the money. And if the projects make money, then people are going to do them. And the reality is today, they don't make money. You know, in generalization, there's obviously some niche exceptions, and this is where the policy debate comes. So once you get policy putting in incentives, and one could argue a carbon price or a carbon market mechanism like the HCU market in Australia is one way to do that, but there are others. That's when you'll see it take off. You know, I sit here in Sydney. Australia's got a lot of CCS potential in particularly offshore. I know the Moomba project gets a lot of attention because it's one of the earlier and lower cost ones, but its scale is limited. If we want to really talk about, 10+ million tonne per annum kind of CCS projects, we're looking, offshore Bass Strait and other parts of Australia. But that's not going to cut it, $10, $20 a tonne. We're going to need to see an incentive price beyond that. As Dan mentions, we might need to see international trading as some of our international partners look to develop, $100 plus carbon pricing that can start to actually really look at not just scope 1 or 2, but actually bringing some carbon potentially back to CCS hubs in Australia. All the potential's there, but you need the price point. And right now we don't yet have the price point, but every time I look at ACCU trading, it's jumping up. We're seeing credits been going above $30 a tonne. So from only under $20 only 12 months ago. So if that trajectory continues, which is what's going to be required to meet our carbon goals, then the economics will follow for CCS projects and they'll start to move forward. We just haven't seen it yet.
Great, thanks very much. And Tracy, I might direct traffic your way as you are a project proponent coming from Exxon. I think you have an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah, I think Sol brought up, policy is clearly important to this. And Dan's point around international movement of carbon, when you look at Asia Pacific and that complex solution of hubs and CCS storage sites, it's going to require a lot of international regulation that isn't there today, layered with the carbon pricing that's moving at different rates, across in different countries when you look at Asia Pacific. So there are, hurdles to overcome. And I think that's another one where collaboration of industry with government really needs to work together. And what are those scenarios and what's the timing for when things, become more commercial on a standalone basis. And it's how do we evolve projects such that we can put things online and evolve to that point in the future, so that we can accelerate, in the near term.
Excellent. Dan, Alex, I'd like to loop you into this conversation as well.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, look, I guess I might just briefly touch on CarbonNet as an example here. I mean, we've been working on CarbonNet for over a decade, and we're still looking at another few years until we'll be getting to a final investment decision. And so I guess for me, to get that deployment happening more quickly, we need to shorten those time scales. And part of that is from a policy perspective, and I think there's an international learning piece here around how we get those regulatory settings right. We can't afford to have any environmental issues with this with these storage sites, but at the same time we probably can't afford to take 15-20 years to develop each one, especially when it's the first of a kind in a country. So I think we really need to kind of crystallize what the key regulatory concerns are and provide some guidance to industry in advance around the key tasks they have to undertake, and try and knock those sort of 15-year timescales back to more 5-year, 6-year timescales.
Great. Alex, thinking about those timescales, as somebody that for a living watches and researches CCS and projects and timelines, and what's the likelihood of us decreasing those timescales to deploy quicker?
Well, I think if the will is there, those timescales can be decreased, but it's still going to be several years for each project. Depends where the project's starting, right? So one of the longest lead items for CCS project is proving up your storage resource. Now, in fact, pretty much every CCS project that's operating today has leveraged pre-existing geological data. So I see the next wave of CCS projects continuing with that trend. So if you're in a location where there's already pretty good geological data available to you, then there is an opportunity to reduce those timeframes, but it requires, of course, the right policy settings, the right regulatory setting to enable those investments to come. If I can make one observation about the feasibility of that. So our analysis is that in round numbers, hitting those 2050 targets will require about $1 trillion of investment globally. That's a lot of money. But the global energy sector invested almost double that just in 1 year. So it's not an absence of money or capital which is a problem here. There's plenty of capital. There's plenty of expertise. There's plenty of know-how. The only barriers here are really the sort of those which are associated with risk, and much of that is able to be addressed through policy. And it's been done before. Another example I'd like to use is the French nuclear industry. You know, that nuclear industry in France was built over a period of about a decade, from nothing to 70+% of their electricity at its peak coming from nuclear in about 10 years in the 70s and 80s. So these sorts of rapid accelerations of particular industries are well within the capability and well within our existing experience. We just need to make it a priority.
Great. I'd like to move away from projects briefly and back to markets. Particularly for you, Saul and Tracy, again, what are you hearing from markets? You know, we have come to hear from, particularly from oil and gas, about low carbon premiums. Is that becoming a baseline expectation for customers, or will there really be a continuing premium on low carbon products, particularly from that sector?
I think I'll start. I think that yes, there's increasing recognition, there's increasing targets being set, and I think when you look as a company to supply those low carbon needs, I think there's many more projects and opportunities now that we're looking to collaborate on. I think the word premium is, you know, it's an interesting word. I think it's really trying to find solutions that look to provide lower carbon solutions, you know, whichever sector you're in, rather than saying absolute, you know, premiums. It's really working with customers to know what their value chain looks like and what are the best ways to adapt that. And I think that's why, you know, CCS is a real focus for us, because rather than changing all of the infrastructure around a value chain, you can really, you know, add this to where you can capture emissions. You can really add this on to an existing value chain. Yeah, you require modifications along the way, but it's something that can really be started today, and it's looking at where are the most cost-effective projects to do that. They require incentives, hence the policy discussion of how can we work with governments to really launch those value chains. But there are opportunities that we're pursuing today that we see can really start doing that to offer those lower carbon products that are needed in order to meet the targets around the world for 2050. So that's why we see the drive and how we're working to address those needs, working collaboratively with others.
Great, thanks very much, Tracy. Saul, I know that you briefly touched on this as well, but a response from you would be great.
Well, I think so. There's a lot of talk about, you know, this premium for green fuels, for example, and some people otherwise like to characterize it as emerging discounts for non-green fuels. You know, we can have the semantic debate. But what I think it does touch on is fundamentally, you know, Matt, to come back to, you know, what's the driver of this, and it does need to be demand side led. You know, I think everyone on this panel is involved more in the production of oil and gas and the production of CCS and the abatement. But, you know, there's limits to what, you know, producers and policy on the producer side can do. So, for example, if Australia's going to do 20 million tonnes per annum of CCS at $50 a tonne, I've got news to you: the Australian government's not going to fork out $1 billion a year to our CCS industry. So ultimately, who needs to pay for that is the customer, because the customer is the one who's ultimately using that fuel. And that's why the policy settings at the demand level, particularly with our key APAC partners, that's what can drive this. And to date, you look at the green cargoes, for example, green LNG cargoes that have been sold, there has been a premium, but the cost of the offsets associated with that has been shared. So the buyer has not been paying the full cost. And that's because everyone's exploring this and moving into that area. But for this to be sustainable, ultimately, your end user, your customer, needs to be willing to pay for the CCS, because CCS is an additional cost in order to get the carbon benefits that come with that. And that is probably where, when we focus so much on policy, we just need to acknowledge there's limits to what producing nations' policy can do, because it will be demand-led for this to be sustainable.
Great. I'd like to ask a follow-up to that and open this question up to the rest of the panel as well. You've talked about finance, you've talked about demand side, and you've talked about the limitations of policy there. I think those are all important points. As we look to Southeast Asia in particular, where CCS is going to be relatively key for some of the faster growing economies and emissions profiles, how do we drive investment in the next with the next decade to make sure that we are getting projects off the ground in that region particularly. So we're talking about developing nations in particular.
I can say some more on that.
I was going to say, Tracy, can I start with you?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's really about mapping out what those opportunities look like. So rather than sit and say, let's wait until all of the, the financial incentives are there, I think it's about working out, so if you take the hubs, for example, working with other, companies, emitters, customers that could use a CCS service, and really piecing together what could a solution look like, and then working with the storage sites on what could we piece together there for various projects, and putting that value chain together so that we can have discussions with policymakers to really see what it takes to move things forward.
Excellent. Dan, Alex, I'd like to bring you back into this conversation as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Look, echoing other comments around, it's really going to be the demand that's going to drive this forward, and we need to create more economic approaches, whether that's through incentives or through market signals. I think looking at the technology approach, the way the Australian government has is key to that too, in terms of trying to really lower those costs and exploit those opportunities to make money. And I guess just making sure as well that we've got that regulatory process right. I guess in a lot of those Asian countries that you were mentioning before, they're sort of starting from a point where they don't actually have a regulatory regime in place, and I've seen the Australian regulators go on a bit of a journey here of not really knowing necessarily which questions to ask, and then gradually focusing in on those. And so I think that those countries that have some experience in regulating these sites and these technologies, sharing those through things like the Asia CCS Network. Like to recognise the great work of Japan in setting that up. But those sort of approaches where we share lessons are going to be really vital in making sure that we keep those costs as low as possible, and we create as strong an economic case as possible for the technology.
I think both Tracy and Dan are absolutely right here. What it's going to take in Southeast Asia in the near term is some leaders in this space who are willing to work together with other leaders in the space from the public and private sector around specific project opportunities to identify what is difficult about advancing those opportunities and how to overcome those difficulties. I think the financial drivers for CCS are still weak, as generally speaking, as Saul identified earlier. But there are strengthening non-financial, non-direct financial drivers for companies to invest in at least the lowest cost opportunities for large-scale CCS projects. And the obvious example there is where you have a large CO2 stream available to you right now already, such as in gas processing, for example. So I can see a scenario whereby some of these very low-cost opportunities to deliver millions of tonnes of abatement in one place per year are the first to proceed. And then what they do is they blaze the way for the others who will follow behind them. They form the anchor clients and customers for future CCS networks. And to some extent, the regulation is brought along with it as those projects are advanced. That's one possible way that I can see CCS deploying more rapidly in Southeast Asia. But it requires leaders such as Exxon, for example, to get behind it and help to drive this forward.
Great. Thanks very much. Saul, did you want to add anything in there, or happy to move on?
I think perhaps just, because we've covered, the demand side and the direct policy side, but the other area where there is a driver here, which isn't immediately apparent, is on the funding side. And I'll give you an example. If we take the Barossa project, Santos's Barossa project at the moment, which is also starting to pursue a CCS option, I think one of the big drivers of that is you have joint venture parties in that project who are under pressure to actually, in order to get the financing in their home countries, and a lot of that is government-led, require a CCS solution to be associated with it. So when you start to say, actually, your financing costs could start to go up, and that doesn't just apply in this area, but in general in equity markets as well, that and that higher financing cost can actually start applying to your entire portfolio and not just on a project-specific basis. That's another driver there. So I think when we talk of the financial incentives, it's not necessarily just here's one carbon price. It's the package of things that go around that, from direct government subsidies, carbon pricing, your weighted average cost of capital, and your ability to attract high-class partners and customers into your project, in addition to any premium that might happen on the customer end.
Perfect. We're talking about projects and developing projects very quickly. One of the key elements to any energy project, and indeed CCS as part of that as an abatement option, is social license. Social license, key sort of underpinning factor. We've talked about it briefly through investor pressure and ESG, Saul, but at more of the project side, I'm really interested to get perspectives. And Alex, I might actually start here with you on social license, particularly in Australia, but I think emerging through our region is some of the older narratives around CCS. And you mentioned it in your presentation, that CCS doesn't work or that it's too expensive. These are becoming untenable positions, I think, in the broad public space and the public sort of market. But how do we overcome some of those issues at a grassroots level, particularly? How do we overcome those issues more broadly as well?
Right. So I think you're referring to some of the sort of old myths around carbon capture and storage. Well, I guess the best way of overcoming the perpetuation of those myths is just to point to what's actually happening, right? So the fact is, it's 50 years old next year. There are 27 facilities operating. There's another 102 going through studies at the moment. The business drivers for investing in CCS are increasing pretty rapidly due to ESG considerations, due to rising cost of carbon, and expectation of rising cost of carbon, due to pressure from stakeholders, shareholders, voters for stronger action on climate change. And all of those factors are, and we're observing this now, driving more and more private action and equity and capital into at least studies around CCS projects, and a proportion of those will proceed to FID and proceed to steel on the ground. So I think that sort of regressive negative thinking and messaging is as you say, it's demonstrably on the facts incorrect, and is gaining less and less traction, which is good to see, because we need a fact-based approach to mitigating climate change.
Great, thanks very much, Tracy. I see you nodding. Yes, Saul, please jump in.
Go ahead, Tracy.
Oh, I was nodding because I was thinking of the work that the CCS Institute's doing in order to tell that story, that this isn't a new technology. It is something that is extremely important to our journey to address climate change, but it is something that we've been doing for decades. And it's companies like ExxonMobil bringing the experience we have from running CCS. We have 9 million tons operating a year. Currently, how can we use experiences that we have to make sure that we do things as efficiently and safely as possible when we take this to multiple locations around the world, and telling that story of the history and the robustness of the solution with the safeguards that are in place, and having that discussion is important. So it's a good question. Over to you, Saul.
Thank you.
I was going to perhaps disagree a little bit with Alex on this, where it's not that I disagree that we should have a fact-based, rational approach, which we must, but I really don't think it's sufficient. If you look at the ESG pressures that we're seeing, a lot of those are populist pressures. They're not necessarily, some of them are fact-based, but a lot of them are not fact-based. So I think that the challenge for particularly the oil and gas industry is, whole history and DNA is engineering, and it's full of very smart technical people. And if the debate on decarbonisation and the approach that we need to take to meet our climate goals was going to be won by who does the best technical research, fact-based report, the oil and gas industry is going to win it. But that is not the reality, right? And you see that in policy playing out all over the world. And the industry needs to actually also fronts a populist argument in terms of what it's doing. So, for example, we've had the two recent, there was a recent academic report criticizing blue hydrogen as being higher emissions than just burning gas without any CCS. And there has not been a strong public rebuttal to that argument. And I can tell you that argument now being led, which is basically against blue hydrogen, against CCS in the production of hydrogen, it's out there. And I get questions on it every day, right? And if you have a very smart fund manager who's across this space asking questions about this and asking about its viability, if he hasn't been convinced yet, and here's someone who's very informed on the space, you've almost certainly not won the argument with the average guy on the street who ultimately votes for the policy here. Similarly, if you look at what's happening in terms of the argument that CCS is just prolonging the use of fossil fuels when it should be used in harder to abate sectors, again, that argument is still a very live argument out there and hasn't been properly rebutted, and the industry hasn't put a good argument forward that's actually resonated with the constituents which it needs, which is the public. So I think the industry needs to do a better job on that front, because otherwise you are going to get these popular backlashes. And when we look at general carbon abatement options in front of us, CCS is still more in that questionable category. Shutting down a coal-fired power station to put on a solar panel is going to get a tick every day of the week. Planting trees, for the most part, is getting some ticks every day of the week. But CCS has not necessarily won everyone over in those camps, and there's still some further work to do.
So Matt, I might jump in as well. I think really from a social license perspective, there's a couple of things that we need to try and convey to the public. And one of those is that we don't have the technology to go completely renewable right now. At some level over the next 10, 15 years, perhaps those technologies will get there. But regardless of what you think about it, we can't get there right now. And so the fossil fuels are going to need to be a vital part of the mix for at least the next 2 decades. And how we use those and how we generate energy out of those will be vital to where we end up in terms of carbon emissions. And I think we do need to broaden the discussion of CCS away from just being about fossil fuel technologies and being about a lot of those negative emission approaches that are mentioned in the GCCSI report, the other industries, the hard to abate sectors, and really kind of making the point that at that once you go past sort of 60% emission reduction, 70% in your power grid, well, you've either got CCS or you've got ridiculous cost increases that are going to be economy crippling for a lot of countries. So, I think we need to get those messages out there as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Dan. Last question of the morning or the afternoon, wherever you're joining us from, is as we head into COP26, what would we judge to be the minimum outcomes that are consistent with quote-unquote success, and what do we anticipate will happen? Alex, I might again start with you and we can get around the room.
Oh, what do we anticipate might happen? That's an easy one. I think what we should be focusing on at COP26 is recognizing that COP26 sets the overall global framework, and it's critically important, obviously. But it's not as important in the near term as local policy and regulation. That's going to drive deployment. But if I was going to point to one thing that I think we really need to be focused on for COP26, and in fact in all future COPs going forwards, are the Article 6 negotiation. So this is the part of the UNFCCC framework that governs international carbon credit trading, what's recognised as emissions abatement, what's not, for example, and all the methods that sit under that. It's critically important that framework recognise all forms of genuine emissions abatement, including carbon capture and storage. Because if it doesn't, then what we will be doing effectively is taking some options off the table. And every time we take an option off the table, the options that are left on the table need to work harder, cost goes up, risk goes up. So I think that's one area we should be focusing on for COP26 and 27 and 28, ensuring that those Article 6 negotiations deliver a comprehensive framework that recognises and values all forms of valid abatement, including carbon capture and storage.
Great, thanks, Alex. Saul, from a private finance perspective, did you want to add anything there?
Well, what I'm looking for really is that the key element of that framework is about carbon offsets and trading between countries, because once that framework starts to set up and we have a kind of more universal standard and tradability of carbon offsets, that's going to trickle down to your kind of nation-based and then project-level financial incentives that we've talked about. So that's what I'm looking for most. And the fundamental reason for that is every day I get a question from a big investor who's asking, you know, what's the future for the fossil fuel sector? And what does an Exxon or a Shell or a Woodside look like in 20 years? Because, you know, some of our European peers, you know, they're going down the route of trying to become more, you know, renewable based. But what about the others? And for what it's worth, I think we could see what is today a lot of fossil fuel companies in 20 years could be some of the largest carbon offsets and carbon credit traders in the world. And that could actually be a material part, or perhaps the largest part of their business, because that's building on an existing footprint, existing capability, both in trading, offset creation, and sequestration. And that could actually start to become a very exciting new growth avenue in 20 years if we are in a world where we have sustained decline in what the current commodities are at the moment. So the first step for that is setting up some international standards, and hopefully COP26 does move us in that direction.
Excellent, thanks. Tracy, Dan, did you want to add anything there?
I think, you know, a lot's been said, yeah, the international value of carbon and the international way that CO2 is managed is clearly, you know, a hot topic, but perhaps a new addition to add to it, I guess, linking back to our CCS discussion here is really that really highlighting that as a solution that's there, that can be scaled up. I think that's really key in this discussion, is what can be scaled up today. You know, there's lots of options for the future, but when we look at CCS, and, you know, just to link back to a kind of the real project we're talking about for Houston, we're looking there at, you know, 50 million tons of CO2 could be sequestered annually by 2030, and then 100 million by 2040. So it's what are those projects that are going to make an impact at scale to complement the whole suite of other projects that are extremely important as we go forward to address the needs. And I guess when we look at Southeast Asia in that debate, if you can put the scalability of solutions in the region, and I think I misquoted earlier, of the 300 billion tons of potential storage capacity just on our, you know, academic studies that we've done. So there's a huge regional potential. How do we tap into that at scale is really important. And it does, I guess, linking to COP, it does need that international work to be done on international climate carbon exchanges is really important to the success of how much that storage capacity can actually get used and the timing of it.
Great, thank you. Dan, I see you nodding there.
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, but I guess the other thing that I'm hoping to get a little bit more out of COP26 is some national long-term strategies. And I guess we've seen a lot of countries commit to net zero, but we've seen less detail on how they're going to get there. So I'm hopeful that a lot of them will recognise the utilisation of this technology is essential in getting there, and that we'll have new opportunities for collaboration off the back of that.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, thank you all for joining us. We're not live in the in-person sense, but I hope that you've appreciated the panel. Thank you to all of the attendees that have joined us today for the launch of the Global Status Report for 2021. As Alex mentioned earlier, you can download it from our website, which is globalccsinstitute.com/resources. We do look forward to hearing from you soon and seeing you at an event even sooner. Have a good day. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.